History taught you a lie. They said civilization begins with writing, that the greatest empires left scrolls and tablets, that progress means carving your name into stone so the future remembers you existed. But what if the opposite is true? What if the most advanced civilizations on Earth never wrote a single word? And that wasn't failure, it was choice. You're standing somewhere between sleep and waking, in that half-light where questions form like mist rising from still water. Across this world, scattered from the Andes to the African savanna, from Pacific islands to European plains, there are monuments that shouldn't exist. In Bolivia, 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air is so thin that thinking becomes difficult, there's a stone block weighing 100 tons. It sits perfectly against its neighbor. No gaps, no mortar. So precise you cannot slide a razor blade between them. Modern engineers study it with laser measuring tools and walk away confused because whoever built it had no metal tools, no written instructions, no blueprints, just hands and stone, and a knowledge we've completely lost. And they never explained how. Not once, not ever. These weren't primitive people who hadn't discovered writing yet. That's the part that breaks your brain. Many of them lived right alongside civilizations that did write. The Egyptians carved hieroglyphs into every surface. The Sumerians pressed cuneiform into wet clay. The Maya wrote books. But these silent architects, they watched, and they chose differently. They built calendars you can only read by watching shadows. They created observatories that tracked the moon with mathematical precision we can barely match today. They shaped entire landscapes into messages that can only be seen from heights their creators could never reach. They left faces carved in stone, with expressions so real you swear they're about to speak. But no names, no dates, no explanations. Just presence. Just mystery. Just stone that has outlasted every empire that tried to explain itself in words. And here's what haunts you in the darkness. What if they understood something fundamental that we've forgotten? What if they knew that words betray you, that translations corrupt meaning, that fire and flood erase every scroll and tablet eventually? What if they trusted stone over story, because stone doesn't lie, doesn't change, doesn't need interpretation? What if the silence wasn't primitive, but sophisticated, beyond anything we can imagine? If you stay with me until the end, you'll see something that changes everything you thought you knew about memory and meaning. You'll understand that these civilizations didn't fail to develop writing. They rejected it. They chose permanence over fame, mystery over explanation, experience over instruction. They built things that would survive not because future generations could read them, but because they would have no choice but to feel them. Right now, wherever you are in the world, leave a comment and tell me your time zone. Tell me if the sun is rising or setting where you stand. Because I want to know how many of us are scattered across this turning planet, all trying to hear voices that spoke without words, all listening to the same ancient silence that has more to say than any book ever written. The journey begins 13,000 feet above sea level, where the air is so thin that thinking becomes difficult, and every breath is work. In a place where stones fit together so perfectly that even silence cannot slip between them. The morning light is about to hit those stones at exactly the right angle, and when it does, you'll see something impossible, something that was never supposed to exist. Are you ready? Are you willing to let go of what you've been taught? Are you brave enough to listen to voices that refuse to speak in words? The stones are waiting. They've been waiting for thousands of years. Let's begin. Chapter 1. Tiwanaku. The stones that shouldn't exist. You're standing on a plateau that shouldn't support life, let alone civilization. 13,000 feet above sea level, the air so thin your lungs work overtime just to feed your brain enough oxygen to think clearly. The wind cuts across the altiplano like a blade made of ice. And yet here they are, stones so massive they make you question everything you thought you knew about human capability. The locals call this place Tiwanaku, though that name came later, much later, after the people who built it had vanished into silence. This single block weighs more than 100 tons of andesite, one of the hardest stones on Earth. It sits flush against its neighbor with such precision that you pull out a business card, then a piece of paper, trying to find any gap between them. And there's nothing. The fit is so perfect that even at the molecular level, these stones seem to have been made for each other. You kneel down, your knee pressing into earth that has held these stones for more than 1,000 years, and you run your hand along the joint. The stone is cold, so cold it pulls heat from your palm like something alive and hungry. But the surface is impossibly smooth, polished to a degree that shouldn't be possible without industrial equipment. Modern engineers come here with laser measuring tools and computer analysis and walk away shaking their heads because the tolerances are tighter than what we achieve today with computer-guided cutting machines. The angles are exact to fractions of a degree. The surfaces are flat to within thousandths of an inch. The fitting is so precise that earthquake after earthquake has shaken this plateau, and still these stones haven't shifted, haven't separated. But here's what makes your skin prickle. The people who did this had no written language, left no instruction manuals, no blueprints, no technical diagrams. They moved stones weighing as much as a passenger jet, fitted them together with precision that would make a Swiss watchmaker weep, and then they simply walked away without ever explaining how or why. Not a single carved inscription, just silence. Just these stones sitting here, patient as mountains. You move to Pumapunku, and here the mystery deepens. The stones aren't just big, they're complex. You're looking at blocks shaped with H-shaped cuts, perfect interlocking grooves, edges so straight they look laser cut, surfaces so flat they could have been produced by a CNC machine. You examine a corner, and the angle is exactly 90 degrees. Not approximately, but exactly, in a way that suggests whoever made this had tools and knowledge the historical record says they couldn't possibly possess. Some blocks have holes drilled through them, perfectly circular holes that go straight down into the hardest stone with walls so smooth they look machined. You peer into one, and you can see the spiral pattern that suggests a rotating tool. But what kind? Copper tools would have taken months to drill a single hole like this. Yet here are dozens, each one perfect, each one precisely placed, serving some purpose we can only guess at, because the builders never left a manual. There's a theory, whispered in academic circles, that these stones weren't cut at all in the way we understand cutting. Some researchers propose that the builders had access to plant-based acids that could soften stone like clay before it hardened again. It sounds like fantasy, until you remember that the Amazon rainforest contains plants with chemical properties we're only beginning to understand. Compounds that can dissolve metal, that can do things modern chemistry struggles to explain. Another theory suggests sound, that low-frequency vibrations could alter the molecular structure of stone, could make it lighter, easier to move. The ancient Egyptians left images of priests carrying what looked like tuning forks. South American cultures told stories about stones that walked, about rocks that moved when sung to in the right way. What if they understood something about sound and matter that we've dismissed as superstition because it doesn't fit our physics? The sun hits a wall at Colossal at a precise angle that only occurs on the equinox. This isn't accident. This is design. The kind of precision that requires understanding celestial mechanics, understanding the precession of the equinoxes in ways that shouldn't be possible. Without telescopes, without written records tracking observations across generations. Yet here it is, built into stone. They didn't write down the mathematics, they built them. They embedded astronomy into architecture in a way that would survive any apocalypse, any conquest. You walk among these stones and start to understand why they might have chosen silence. Words can be burned. Tablets can be smashed. Libraries can be destroyed by invading armies or time itself. But you can't burn stone that weighs 100 tons. You can't mistranslate a shadow that falls at the equinox. You can't corrupt a measurement built into thousands of tons of stone. Maybe they understood that the most important knowledge couldn't be trusted to anything as fragile as writing. There's a stone here called the Gate of the Sun. A single block weighing 10 tons, carved with figures that seem to dance across its surface. At the center is a figure they call the Gateway God, though that's just a name given by people who came later. This figure is surrounded by smaller beings that might be running toward it or away. And the whole composition has an energy that makes it feel less like a static carving and more like a moment frozen in stone. This is a language, just not one made of words. It's a visual grammar that speaks directly to something pre-verbal in the human mind, something that bypasses translation because it touches archetypal images that resonate across cultures and time. You can stand here knowing nothing about Tiwanaku and still feel something, still sense that it's important, that it's trying to communicate in a way that doesn't depend on understanding their words. You think about all the civilizations that did write. The Roman Forum is ruins now. The Library of Alexandria is ash. The great palaces of Mesopotamia are dust. But these stones, made by people who never wrote their names, who never carved a single boastful inscription, these stones remain. Not intact, but present. Still here. Still asking questions. Still refusing to give easy answers. You place your palm against one of the massive blocks, and the stone is cold, pulling heat from your hand like it's been waiting centuries for warmth, for contact. There's something else too, something you can't name. It's the feeling you get in the presence of something made with intention, with purpose, with care that goes beyond construction. This wasn't just a city, this was a statement, though not in words. This was a message, encoded in stone and space, and astronomical alignment. We were here. We understood things you've forgotten, and we trusted you to be smart enough to figure it out. As tourists begin to arrive with cameras and guidebooks, you step back. You watch them move through this space like it's a museum exhibit rather than a mystery, like something that can be understood in an afternoon. And you understand why this journey begins here, why Tiwanaku is first. Because it represents the fundamental question that haunts every silent civilization. If you can build this, If you can move 100-ton stones with such precision, if you can encode astronomical knowledge into architecture that will last 10,000 years, why would you not write it down? What kind of wisdom chooses mystery over explanation? Maybe the answer is simpler than we think. Maybe they knew that anything worth knowing is worth discovering yourself. Maybe they understood that written knowledge makes you lazy, makes you accept without questioning. But standing here, you're forced to think. You're forced to question. You're forced to admit that your education might have confused silence with ignorance, when silence might actually have been the highest form of wisdom. The sun is warm now on your face. You take one last look at the stones before moving on. But something stays with you. These people trusted stone over story. They trusted experience over explanation. They built things that would force future generations to stop, to wonder, to question everything they thought they knew. And in doing that, they achieved something no written empire ever did. They made themselves impossible to ignore, impossible to forget. Even though we don't know their names, even though we can't read their thoughts. Are you ready for the next mystery? Because we're about to descend into a river valley where an entire city was built from earth and aligned with the moon, where the ground itself was sculpted into a massive three-dimensional text that you can only read by walking. The path continues, and the silence has more to say. Chapter 2. Cahokia, the city built from earth and moonlight. You're descending from the thin air of the Andes into the humid embrace of the Mississippi River Valley, and the landscape changes completely. The year is 1050 CE, and if you could stand here then, you'd be looking at the largest city in North America, larger than London at the same moment in history. A sprawling metropolis of 20,000 souls living around massive earthen pyramids that rise from the floodplain like the bones of sleeping giants. But here's what makes your breath catch. They built all of this without leaving a single written word to explain who they were or what they believed. You're standing at the base of Monk's Mound, and even now, 1,000 years after the last basket of earth was carried up its slopes, it dominates the horizon. It's 10 stories tall, covers 14 acres at its base, and contains more than 22 million cubic feet of earth. Every single particle was carried here in baskets, one handful at a time, by people who had no wheels, no draft animals, no machinery, just human hands and human backs, and a vision so clear that entire generations devoted their lives to its completion. You try to imagine the planning required, not just the physical logistics of moving millions of baskets of earth, but the social organization, the hierarchy, the system of beliefs that could coordinate thousands of workers over decades without written instructions, without blueprints. Someone had to envision this, calculate angles and dimensions, organize workers, maintain morale through decades of repetitive labor. And yet, they never wrote down the plan. They never carved their names. They never left instructions. You climb to the top, your calves burning from the steep ascent, and when you reach the summit, you turn to face the city laid out below, in a pattern that makes your skin prickle. There are smaller mounds arranged in precise geometric relationships to this central pyramid, and beyond them, wooden posts set in circles marking the movements of the sun and moon, with such accuracy that archaeologists call them Woodhenge. You're looking at a city designed as a single, unified text. A three-dimensional book written in earth and wood and empty space. A book that can only be read by walking through it. The people who built this are called the Mississippians now, though that's just a label. Their real name is lost. Their language is lost. Their stories are lost. But their city remains. Enough to tell you they understood astronomy and geometry and urban planning that shouldn't be possible without written records. They tracked the moon's cycles with such precision they could predict eclipses. They aligned structures to mark equinoxes and solstices. They created a calendar built into the very fabric of their city. You descend and walk toward one of these wooden circles. The original posts are gone, but archaeologists have marked their positions, and you start to understand the genius. These posts create sightlines, frame celestial events, turn the entire horizon into a clock and calendar. Stand in the center on the summer solstice and watch the sun rise behind a specific post. Stand in the same place on the equinox and it rises behind a different post. This is knowledge encoded in landscape, in the relationship between earth and sky. They didn't need to write it down, because the land itself became the text, permanent, unchanging. But there's something else here, something darker you need to see. You walk to a smaller mound designated as Mound 72, and this is where the story turns. When excavated in the 1960s, they found something that shouldn't exist in a culture this sophisticated. They found bodies, hundreds of bodies, not buried with care, but arranged in patterns, in ways that suggest ritual, sacrifice. In the center, a man lying on a bed of 20,000 shell beads arranged in the shape of a bird. Around him, 4 men with their heads and hands cut off. Nearby, 53 young women buried together in a single pit. In another section, 39 men and women, some showing signs of violent death, some apparently buried alive. And through it all, not a single written explanation, not one inscription that says, "This is why we did this. This is what we believed." You stand in the afternoon sun trying to reconcile these two images. The brilliant astronomers who could track celestial mechanics with mathematical precision, and the rulers who ordered the deaths of hundreds to mark some religious occasion. Were they different people? Different time periods? Or is this the uncomfortable truth? That sophistication and brutality can coexist. That a culture can be advanced in some ways and horrifying in others. The absence of writing means we're forced to see them whole, to accept the mystery without their justification. The city reached its peak around 1100 CE, and then, sometime around 1350 CE, the people simply left. Not all at once, but gradually, year by year, until the great mounds stood empty. Archaeologists have theories: environmental degradation, overhunting, political collapse, disease, climate change. But those are educated guesses. The people themselves never documented why they left. They built this magnificent city, lived here for 300 years, created one of the most sophisticated urban centers in the ancient world, and then walked away without leaving a note. You turn slowly, taking in the vast emptiness, and you start to understand something crucial about silence. When a civilization writes everything down, you can see their decline coming. You can read their complaints about harvests failing, about social unrest. But when a civilization stays silent, their end comes with the same mysterious authority as their beginning. One day they're here, building and thriving. The next day, historically speaking, they're gone. There's a lesson here that goes deeper than archaeology. These people understood that some things can only be transmitted through experience, through standing in a specific place at a specific time, and seeing how sunlight catches a mound at the equinox, how wooden posts frame the rising moon. They trusted that future generations would be curious enough, attentive enough to learn this language of earth and sky. They trusted the permanence of landscape over the fragility of words. And in some ways they were right. The mounds are still here. The astronomy is still accurate, still marking the same celestial events it marked 1,000 years ago. But in other ways the gamble failed, because without words to anchor meaning, we're left guessing about beliefs and practices and daily life. The shadows grow longer, and you take one last look at Monk's Mound rising against the evening sky. This city was a statement in earth and astronomical precision. It was a message that says, we understood time. We tracked the heavens. We organized thousands of people into a coherent vision. And we trusted that the land itself would remember what we were, even if no one remembers our names. But here's the question that follows you. What if they knew something we've forgotten about the relationship between knowledge and writing? What if they understood that writing things down changes them, reduces them, makes them smaller than they were when they existed only as lived experience? What if the greatest wisdom can't be written, because the act of writing destroys the very thing you're trying to preserve? The path continues onward, and the next stop takes you even further back in time, to a culture that carved faces in stone with such skill, such mysterious authority, that when the Spanish conquistadors first saw them, they couldn't believe the ancestors of the people they were conquering could have made anything so magnificent. The silence deepens, and the stones are about to speak again. Chapter 3. The Olmec. Faces without names. You're moving through time now, sliding backward into deeper history. The year is 1200 BCE, and you're standing in what will one day be called Mexico, in a landscape where the jungle grows so thick that entire cities can vanish beneath green curtains of vegetation in a single generation. This is the birthplace of what archaeologists call the mother culture of Mesoamerica, the civilization that laid the foundation for everything that came after. But the people who lived here never called themselves anything we can pronounce. They simply carved their faces into stone and left them staring across the centuries with expressions so human, so impossibly present, that you can't shake the feeling they're about to speak. You're standing in front of one of these heads now, and the scale makes your brain struggle to process what you're seeing. It's 8 feet tall, carved from a single massive boulder of basalt that came from a mountain 60 miles away. 60 miles through jungle and swamp and river, moving a stone that weighs between 20 and 50 tons, using no wheels, no draft animals, no machinery that left any archaeological trace, just human ingenuity and determination, and a vision so compelling that entire communities devoted months or years to bringing this single stone from mountain to coast so it could be shaped into a face. You walk around it slowly, studying the features. Every detail tells you this isn't generic, isn't symbolic. This is a specific person. The lips are full and slightly parted. The nose is broad and distinctive. The eyes have a weight to them, a gravity that suggests this person knew things, had seen things, carried authority. But who? A king? A warrior? A priest? The stone won't say. There's no inscription, no name, no title, no date. Just presence. Just this face staring at you across 3,000 years of silence with an expression that might be confidence, or challenge, or wisdom, or something else entirely. There are 17 of these heads scattered across the Olmec heartland, each one different, clearly depicting different individuals. Some wear elaborate helmets with distinctive designs. Some have peaceful expressions. Others look fierce, ready for battle. You start to see them as a gallery, faces that were important enough to merit this extraordinary investment of labor. Important enough that their likenesses needed to survive in the hardest stone available. But the Olmec never felt compelled to tell you why. Just faces, just stone. Just the maddening certainty that these people mattered intensely to someone. The heads aren't the only thing they left. You walk through their ceremonial centers and see evidence of sophisticated urban planning. Drainage systems carved into stone. Raised platforms above swampy ground. Monuments arranged in precise geometric patterns, aligned with cardinal directions. They carve jaguars and serpents in strange composite beings that are half human and half animal, suggesting transformation, shamanic journeys, altered states of consciousness. They work jade with such skill that their jewelry wouldn't look out of place in a modern museum. They drilled holes through jade with perfectly circular perforations that run straight through without cracking it. The technical mastery is undeniable. They created a trade network that stretched for hundreds of miles. They developed a calendar system, and they possibly developed a form of writing. You're looking at the Kasakahal block, discovered in 1999, covered with 62 symbols arranged in horizontal rows. They might be writing, might be the oldest example of written language in the Americas, predating Maya hieroglyphs by centuries. Or they might be decorative, or religious. Scholars have been arguing about it for decades, and the stone keeps its secrets. Because there's not enough context, not enough similar examples. But here's what makes you pause. If this is writing, if these symbols do represent language, then the Olmec had the capability to leave detailed records. And they didn't. Or they did so rarely that almost nothing survived. Which means the silence might not have been inability. It might have been choice. A decision to let the faces speak for themselves, to trust that stone carved with sufficient skill could communicate something more fundamental than words. You kneel and run your fingers across the weathered surface of one of the heads. The stone is warm from the sun, rough with age, but still undeniably present. 3,000 years of empires rising and falling, and this face remains. The person it depicts is gone, their name forgotten, their deeds unrecorded. But the face remains. And maybe that's the point. Maybe the Olmec understood that names are fragile, that words can be twisted. But a face, carved with precision, can't be mistranslated, can only be seen, experienced, felt in that deep pre-verbal part of the brain that recognizes human presence across vast gulfs of time. There's something else you need to understand. When the Spanish arrived and saw these heads, they couldn't believe indigenous people had made them. The features looked too broad, the lips too full, the noses too flat by European standards. And so theories emerged about African sailors crossing the Atlantic 3,000 years ago. Most archaeologists dismiss these theories, pointing to the incredible diversity of human facial features within indigenous American populations. But the theories persist because the faces are so distinctive, so clearly depicting real people whose features don't match simplified stereotypes. you realize this is what happens when a culture doesn't write its own history. Other people write it for you. Other people project their assumptions, their prejudices onto the silence you left behind. The Olmec didn't leave text explaining who they were, and so everyone from Spanish priests to conspiracy theorists has filled that silence with their own stories. Some see African explorers, some see Atlantean refugees, some see alien intervention. The faces stare back at all these theories with the same enigmatic expression, neither confirming nor denying. The Olmec flourished for about 1,000 years, and then they faded. Not in catastrophic collapse, but in gradual transformation, their influence spreading into other Mesoamerican cultures. Their artistic style appears in Maya and Zapotec art. Their calendar system influenced civilizations that came after. But the Olmec themselves vanished into the same silence that characterized their entire existence. No final message, no explanation. Just the heads, weathering slowly in the jungle. You step back and let your eyes move from face to face, and something crystallizes. These people understood something about memory and identity that we've lost. What survives isn't the details of daily life, or the names of kings, or the dates of battles. What survives is presence. The feeling of standing in front of something made with such care that it forces you to acknowledge that real people were here, that they mattered, that they created something that still has the power to make you stop and wonder 3,000 years later. The sun is setting and the light catches the curves of the stone faces in a way that makes them seem almost alive, shadows creating the illusion of depth and movement. You think about all the civilizations that wrote extensively about themselves. How many Roman emperors can you name? How many of their faces can you picture? But these nameless Olmec individuals are more present, more real, more impossible to dismiss than most documented rulers of history. Maybe that's the lesson of this chapter. Maybe the Olmec understood that if you want to be remembered, you don't explain yourself, you don't justify your existence with words. You create something so skillful, so powerful, so undeniably present, that people have no choice but to stop and acknowledge that you were here, that you were real, that you achieved something that still raises questions that can't be answered. The path continues, and the silence grows deeper still, because the next civilization you'll encounter didn't just choose not to write. They might have invented writing and then deliberately abandoned it, might have looked at the technology of script and decided that some things are too important to risk corrupting with translation. The mystery isn't just about absence anymore. It's about choice, conscious and deliberate. Chapter 4, Vinča, the script that history forgot. You're crossing an ocean now, leaving the Americas behind and traveling to a place where the Danube River curves through fertile plains, where the soil is black and rich, and people have been farming for longer than most history books want to admit. The year is 5500 BCE, which means you're standing more than 7,000 years in the past, so deep in prehistory that most people's mental map of human civilization doesn't even extend this far. But here in what will one day be called Serbia, people were already living in large settlements, crafting sophisticated pottery, working copper at temperatures that required advanced kiln technology. And they were doing something else, something that shouldn't be possible for another 2,000 years, according to the standard narrative. They were writing. You're holding a pottery shard, feeling the texture of clay shaped and fired thousands of years ago, and on its surface you can see symbols, deliberate marks that repeat across multiple artifacts, patterns that look systematic, structured, organized in ways that suggest meaning. They're not pictures, they're abstract signs, geometric shapes, combinations that suggest grammar, syntax, the kind of structural relationships that characterize true writing systems rather than simple decoration. You run your finger across the incised lines, feeling the grooves, and you feel the weight of what you're holding. This could be evidence that everything you were taught about the origin of writing is wrong, that the first scripts didn't emerge in Mesopotamia around 3200 BCE, but here, more than 2,000 years earlier. But here's the problem. If you acknowledge that these symbols are true writing, you have to rewrite the entire narrative of human civilization. You have to admit that the story of progress marching steadily from east to west, from Mesopotamia to Egypt to Greece to Rome, might be missing crucial chapters. The people who made these marks are called the Vinca culture now, named after a site near Belgrade. They lived in large settlements, some housing as many as 2,000 people. Their houses were arranged in careful rows along streets wide enough for carts. They had communal ovens, workshop areas, evidence of social organization that suggests planning, hierarchy, shared purpose. They smelted copper at temperatures requiring sophisticated kiln technology. They created ceramics with distinctive black burnished surfaces. They traded across vast distances. They were, by any reasonable definition, civilized, in ways that match or exceed many cultures that came later. And on their pottery, figurines, and clay tablets, they inscribed these symbols. Some scholars have counted more than 200 distinct signs in the Vinca corpus, which is enough for a syllabary, more than enough for a writing system that could represent language with reasonable accuracy. But here's where the academic arguments begin. To call this writing requires proof that they represent language, that they encode speech, that they function the way Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs function. And that proof is maddeningly absent, because we don't have long texts, don't have bilingual inscriptions, don't have any contemporary descriptions of how the symbols were supposed to be read. But what if the absence of proof isn't proof of absence? What if these symbols are writing, and we simply haven't cracked the code? Or what if they deliberately kept their writing system limited, deliberately chose not to expand it into full bureaucratic documentation? Because here's what's strange. The Vinca signs appear on pottery, on personal objects, on items used in daily life. But they don't appear on monuments, don't appear on public buildings. There are no boastful inscriptions about kings or conquests. The writing seems personal, private, almost intimate. Like they understood the technology of recording information, but chose to use it sparingly, chose not to let writing become the dominant mode of knowledge transmission. Like they found a balance point between orality and literacy, between the flexibility of spoken language and the fixity of written language. You walk through the reconstructed remains of a Vinca settlement, and the sophistication is undeniable. Planned communities with standardized house designs, streets wide enough for carts to pass, centralized craft production areas. They worked the land efficiently enough to support populations larger than many medieval European towns. They created trade networks spanning hundreds of miles. And yet they left no epic poems in stone, no king lists, no historical chronicles, no detailed records. Just these tantalizing symbols on pottery. The mystery deepens when you realize the Vinca culture lasted more than 1,000 years, from around 5700 BCE to 4500 BCE. 1,000 years is enough time for writing systems to develop and elaborate. The time span from first Egyptian hieroglyphs to full development was less than that. But the Vinča symbols remain frustratingly static, neither expanding into full literacy nor disappearing entirely. It's as if they found a balance point, a way of using symbolic notation that served their purposes without becoming an all-consuming documentation obsession. There's a scholar named Maria Gimbutas who spent decades studying these symbols and proposed something radical. She suggested they represented a sophisticated system of religious and symbolic thought, a visual language communicating sacred concepts, seasonal rituals, goddess worship. She pointed to recurring motifs, to combinations that seem to carry meaning beyond simple tallying. And whether you accept her specific interpretations or not, her larger point remains compelling. These people were communicating something through these marks, something important enough to repeat across generations, something that mattered enough to preserve.
You pick up another fragment and study the symbols in the fading light.
The Vinca culture eventually collapsed, or rather transformed, absorbed into waves of migration and cultural change that swept across Europe in the 5th millennium BCE. And when they disappeared, their symbols disappeared with them, leaving no descendants, no clear line of transmission to later writing systems. It's as if they took their secrets with them, as if whatever these symbols meant died with the people who could read them. The academic establishment remains divided on the Vinca signs, split between those who argue this is genuine writing deserving recognition as the oldest script in the world, and those who insist it's merely proto-writing. But standing here among these ancient artifacts, holding sherds that predate the pyramids by thousands of years, you start to suspect the argument itself might be missing the point. Maybe the Vinca people didn't care about our definitions. Maybe they developed exactly the system they needed, and no more. Maybe they understood that full literacy comes with costs as well as benefits. Maybe they understood that once you start writing everything down, you change who has power in society. You create literate elites who control access to knowledge. You make knowledge more rigid, harder to adapt. Maybe they saw the limitations as well as the possibilities of writing, and chose deliberately to use it sparingly, to keep most knowledge in oral tradition, in practices, in embodied wisdom that can't be written down, because it exists in the doing rather than in the description. The sun has set completely, and you're standing in darkness, but you can still feel the weight of the pottery in your hands, still sense the presence of the person who inscribed these marks 7,000 years ago. They had a message they wanted to communicate, something important enough to preserve. But they didn't feel compelled to explain themselves to you, to future archaeologists, to distant civilizations that would arise after they were gone. They wrote for their own time, for their own people, for purposes that made sense in their world, even if those purposes are opaque to yours. And maybe that's the most profound lesson of the Vinca culture. Maybe they teach us that the development of writing isn't inevitable, isn't a single path that all civilizations must follow. Maybe there are multiple ways to be sophisticated, multiple ways to preserve and transmit knowledge. Maybe some of those ways involve choosing not to write everything down, choosing to keep some things mysterious, choosing to let certain forms of knowledge die with the people who possess them, rather than risking their corruption. The path continues deeper into history, deeper into silence, to places where the choice not to write becomes even more deliberate, even more striking. Because the next civilizations built structures requiring generations of coordinated effort, demonstrating mathematical and astronomical knowledge that rivals anything in the written record. Yet they left no explanation. The silence isn't accidental anymore. It's becoming a pattern. It's becoming a statement you can't ignore. Chapter 5. Chachapoyas, the cloud warriors who built in silence. You're climbing now, ascending into mist so thick you can taste it on your tongue like something solid, like you're breathing water rather than air. Into a landscape where clouds don't pass overhead in orderly processions, but wrap around you like living things, like the embrace of something ancient that's been waiting here long before humans arrived and will remain long after we're gone. This is the cloud forest of northern Peru, and the name isn't metaphorical or poetic. It's literal, descriptive of a place where the Andes meet the Amazon and create something neither mountain nor jungle but both at once. A vertical world of moss-draped trees and orchids blooming in the fog, and valleys so deep that looking down makes your stomach drop, makes you feel the vertigo, not just in your body, but in your mind, as you try to comprehend the scale of emptiness below you, the distance between where you stand and where the ground lies waiting, thousands of feet down. The air here is saturated with moisture, every breath heavy with the weight of water that hasn't quite decided to become rain, and everything you touch is damp, covered in moss or lichen, or the green film of algae that grows on any surface that stays still long enough. Trees tower overhead, their trunks invisible in the mist, their branches reaching out like arms trying to touch you, to pull you into the embrace of the forest that wants to reclaim everything, that's patient enough to wait centuries if necessary. And somewhere in this impossible terrain, built into cliffsides and mountain ridges that seem designed to keep humans out, a people called the Chachapoyas built a civilization that the Inca couldn't conquer and the Spanish could barely find. A culture that left fortresses clinging to cliffsides and mummies staring out from caves, and not a single written word to explain who they were, or what they believed, or why they chose to live in a place where every step could be your last, where one moment of inattention could send you tumbling into clouds that would swallow your screams before anyone could hear them. You're standing before Cuelap now, and the scale of it hits you like a physical force, like a wall of sound or a blast of wind that makes you take a step back and reconsider everything you thought you knew about what's possible at this altitude, in this terrain, with the limited resources available to people who had no metal tools beyond copper and bronze, who had no wheeled vehicles to transport materials, who had nothing but human muscle and human ingenuity, and a vision so compelling that 3,000 people devoted their lives to building and maintaining this impossible place. The fortress rises from the mountainside, 3,000 feet above the valley floor. Its walls 60 feet high in places, built from millions of limestone blocks fitted together with such precision that after 1,000 years, they still stand solid and impenetrable, still present, still refusing to collapse despite earthquakes and rain, and the slow, patient work of roots that push into every crack, seeking moisture and space to grow. The walls curve inward as they rise, creating a profile that looks organic, almost alive, like the fortress grew here, rather than being built stone by human hands, that bled and blistered and kept working because the vision demanded it, because the community needed it, because whatever beliefs or threats or purposes drove this construction were powerful enough to overcome exhaustion and injury, and the 100 small reasons that would make rational people give up and build somewhere easier, somewhere that didn't require carrying millions of stones up a mountainside so steep that modern climbers need ropes and harnesses to ascend it safely. There's only one entrance, a narrow passageway that forces visitors to walk single file through a corridor so tight that 3 defenders could hold off an army, so defensible that attacking it would be suicide, so clearly designed for security that you understand immediately that these people feared something, expected invasion, built this place knowing that someday enemies would come, and the only thing that would save them was walls thick enough to resist assault and high enough to make scaling them impossible. The Chachapoyas designed this place to be unconquerable, and for centuries it was. A city in the clouds that housed 3,000 people at its peak, that functioned as home and fortress and ceremonial center all at once, that demonstrated understanding of defensive architecture that would impress medieval European castle builders, that showed sophistication in military engineering that shouldn't exist without written military manuals, without textbooks explaining siege warfare and fortification design, and the principles of creating structures that can resist determined assault. But here's what makes you stop and stare and question everything. What makes your mind spin, trying to reconcile what you're seeing with what you've been taught about technological development and cultural sophistication. They built all of this. Every stone, every wall, every carefully engineered water channel and storage facility and residential platform, without leaving any record of who ordered it built or why, or how they organized the labor required to move millions of stones up a mountainside so steep that modern construction equipment would struggle with the grade. So remote that simply getting workers and materials to the site would be a logistical nightmare that would challenge modern project managers with all their planning software and communication technology. The Inca eventually absorbed the Chachapoyas into their empire, but even the Inca records, detailed as they were about other conquered peoples, recording their tributaries and their obligations and their integration into the vast administrative system that made the Inca Empire function, even those records have almost nothing to say about these cloud warriors. It's as if the Chachapoyas resisted documentation, the way their fortress resisted assault. As if they understood that the best way to remain unconquered was to remain unexplained. As if they knew that what you don't write down can't be used against you by enemies who might capture your records and learn your secrets, by conquerors who might use your own words to justify their domination and erase your history, and replace it with narratives that serve their purposes. You walk through the ruins, and everywhere you look there's evidence of sophisticated understanding of engineering and hydrology and defensive architecture that goes beyond simple wall building, that shows minds that could think in 3 dimensions, that could anticipate problems and design solutions, that could plan not just for the present, but for generations of future use. They built their houses on circular stone platforms to keep them level on the steep slopes, to create flat surfaces where none existed naturally, to prevent erosion and water damage and the slow sliding that happens when you build on inclines without proper engineering. Each platform represents days of work, stones carried and placed and adjusted until the surface was level enough to support a house, until the drainage was good enough to prevent water from pooling and undermining the structure. They created drainage systems that channeled rainwater away from living areas and into storage cisterns, understanding that in this climate where rain falls almost daily for much of the year, you need to manage water or it will manage you, will seep into your walls and rot your timbers and create the damp conditions where disease flourishes. The channels are carved into stone in some places, lined with carefully placed rocks in others, creating a network that still functions after 1,000 years, that still moves water where it needs to go. that shows the kind of practical engineering knowledge that comes from generations of living in this environment and learning from mistakes and gradually developing solutions that work. They carved decorative friezes into the walls, showing geometric patterns and stylized faces, with features that don't match any other culture in the region. Faces with broad foreheads and prominent cheekbones, and expressions that seem to be simultaneously human and something else. Something that lived in the clouds and looked down on the world below with a mixture of curiosity and detachment. Something that had transcended purely human concerns and achieved some kind of perspective that comes from living at the boundary between earth and sky. The faces repeat across the fortress, suggesting shared symbolism, religious beliefs that were expressed in architecture, ways of understanding the world that were built into the very stones of the place where they lived. But the fortress isn't the strangest thing the Chachapoyas left behind, isn't the most unsettling evidence of their presence in this landscape. You're descending now, following a narrow trail that clings to the cliffside like a scar, like a wound in the mountain that refuses to heal. And ahead of you, tucked into a natural alcove in the rock face 300 feet above the valley floor, you see them. Sarcophagi, dozens of them. Tall anthropomorphic coffins made of clay and wood and paint, standing upright in the cave, as if the dead inside are watching, waiting, guarding something. As if death didn't end their relationship with the living, but transformed it, made them sentinels who would stand eternal watch over the valleys where their descendants lived and worked, and eventually died, and were brought here to join the watching dead. The Spanish called them Purunmachus, the Ancient Ones, and when they first encountered these burial sites in their conquest of this region, they were so disturbed by the sight of these sentinels staring out from the cliffs that they smashed many of them, convinced they were pagan idols that needed to be destroyed, that represented demon worship or witchcraft, or the kind of beliefs that threatened Christian souls and needed to be eradicated for the spiritual safety of the indigenous people they were supposedly saving. The fact that the indigenous people didn't want to be saved, that they had their own perfectly functional belief systems that had sustained them for centuries, that the destruction of these sarcophagi represented cultural genocide of a type that we're only now beginning to understand and name. None of that mattered to conquistadors who believed they were doing God's work by destroying everything that didn't fit into their narrow understanding of how humans should worship and remember their dead. You're looking at one of these sarcophagi now, one that survived the Spanish vandalism, either because it was too remote or too well hidden, or simply because the Spanish ran out of enthusiasm for climbing cliffs to destroy burial sites when there was gold to be found, and cities to conquer, and glory to be won in more accessible locations. The face painted on it is haunting in its detail, not generic or stylized, but specific, individual, suggesting a particular person whose features were important enough to preserve in this form. The eyes are wide and staring, painted in a way that creates the illusion that they're following you as you move, that wherever you stand in relation to the sarcophagus, those eyes are watching you, judging you, seeing something in you that you might not want to acknowledge about yourself. The mouth is a thin line that could be peaceful acceptance of death, or could be holding back words that were never meant to be spoken aloud. Secrets that died with the person inside, and will remain forever silent, unless someone figures out how to make the dead speak. The entire figure is painted in earth tones, reds and whites and ochres derived from minerals and plants that somehow survived centuries of rain and wind, and the relentless humidity of the cloud forest that should have washed away any pigment, that should have reduced these painted surfaces to blank clay long ago, but instead preserved them through some quality of the paint or the clay, or the microclimate of the cave that protected them from the worst of the weather. Inside this coffin is a mummy, a person who died perhaps 800 years ago, and was placed here by people who believed that the dead should watch over the living, that those who passed on should remain present in some way, should continue to have a relationship with the world they left behind. The body was prepared according to practices we can only partially reconstruct from the few undisturbed burials that archaeologists have found. Wrapped in textiles woven with patterns that probably had significance we can't decode. Placed in a fetal position that might represent rebirth, or return to the womb of the earth, or some other symbolic meaning that died with the culture that practiced it. And then the sarcophagus was sealed and carried up to this cliff and placed in position where it would stand, perhaps for centuries, perhaps forever, watching over the valleys where the Chachapoyas lived their lives and raised their children, and built their fortresses, and eventually disappeared into silence. But who were these people? The Chachapoyas left no genealogies tracing their lineage back to mythical ancestors, no king lists documenting rulers and their achievements, no declarations of conquest or territorial claims carved into stone monuments that would let us know how they understood their own history, who they thought they were, where they believed they came from. The mummies themselves offer few clues, because the Spanish and later tomb raiders disturbed most of them, scattering bones and textiles and grave goods in their search for gold and valuables, destroying context and stratigraphy in all the information that careful archaeological excavation might have revealed about how these burials were conducted and what they meant to the people who performed them. What we know about the Chachapoyas comes almost entirely from archaeology, from the patient work of excavating their settlements and analyzing their artifacts, and trying to reconstruct their culture from material remains that were never meant to tell their whole story, and from scattered references in Inca and Spanish records written by outsiders who didn't understand these cloud people and didn't particularly care to, who were more interested in conquest and conversion than in documenting the cultures they were destroying. The Inca called them warriors, said they were fierce defenders of their territory, that they fought with slings and spears, and a determination that made them formidable opponents, despite being eventually absorbed into the Inca Empire. The Spanish noted that they were taller than most indigenous peoples they encountered, that they had lighter skin than lowland populations, that their features were distinctive enough to make European chroniclers wonder about their origins and speculate about possible connections to distant peoples, in ways that reveal more about European prejudices than about Chachapoya's ethnicity. And here's where the story gets tangled in the same kind of speculation that haunted the Olmec heads, the same uncomfortable questions about who gets to claim which achievements in history, the same tendency for people to project their own agendas onto silence and fill gaps in the historical record with narratives that serve their purposes rather than illuminating the truth. Because some Spanish chroniclers, unable to believe that indigenous Americans could build something as sophisticated as Cuelap, suggested that the Chachapoyas must have been descended from European or Middle Eastern peoples who somehow crossed the ocean in ancient times, that they were lost tribes or shipwrecked sailors, or refugees from old world civilizations who brought their knowledge and skills to the New World and built these fortresses, and created this culture that seemed too advanced to be purely indigenous. These theories have been thoroughly debunked by genetic evidence, showing that the Chachapoyas were indeed indigenous to the Americas, that their DNA links them to other Native American populations, that there's no evidence of significant Old World admixture in their ancestry. But the theories persist in certain circles, because the silence the Chachapoyas left behind creates a vacuum that people rush to fill with their own narratives, their own assumptions, their own need to explain what refuses to be explained. The absence of self-documentation makes cultures vulnerable to having their stories told by others. by people who weren't there, who didn't understand them, who approached them with preconceptions and biases that shaped what they saw and what they recorded, and what they chose to preserve or destroy. You're sitting now on a stone wall, catching your breath in the thin air that never quite feels like it's giving you enough oxygen, no matter how deeply you breathe. And you think about what it means to build in a place like this. What it says about a people's priorities and beliefs and understanding of their relationship with the landscape. The Chachapoyas didn't choose easy terrain. They didn't settle in fertile valleys where flat land was abundant and water was reliable, and life would be comfortable by the standards of agricultural societies. They didn't build on coastal plains where trade would be easy and resources would be diverse, and the climate would be moderate year-round. They built in the clouds, in a landscape so vertical and so shrouded in mist that most of their world was hidden most of the time, where you could walk for days and never see the sky clearly, where the weather could change from brilliant sunshine to torrential rain in minutes with no warning, where a single storm could dump enough water to turn trails into rivers and turn slopes into mudslides that could bury you before you had time to react. Why? What drew them to this impossible place? What made them invest the enormous labor required to build cities on mountainsides, to carve burial caves into sheer cliffs, to create a civilization in terrain that seems designed to repel human habitation? Maybe they understood something about visibility and vulnerability, about the relationship between being seen and being conquered. Maybe they knew that what can be easily seen can be easily conquered, that what can be easily reached can be easily destroyed, that if you want to remain independent, to maintain your way of life, to resist the empires that periodically sweep across the Andes, absorbing smaller cultures into their administrative systems, then you need to build where others can't easily reach you, where the very difficulty of the terrain becomes your primary defense. The Inca eventually did conquer them, but it took decades and tremendous effort. And even then, the Chachapoyas maintained a degree of autonomy that frustrated Inca administrators who were accustomed to more complete control over conquered peoples. The Cloud Warriors never fully integrated into the Inca system, never completely abandoned their own identity and practices, never became simply another province of the empire, but remained distinct, troublesome. A constant reminder that some peoples are harder to conquer than others, that geography can be as powerful as walls in determining whether a culture survives contact with more powerful neighbors. When the Spanish arrived and used Chachapoyas warriors as allies against the Inca, the Cloud people saw an opportunity to regain their independence, to throw off Inca rule and return to the autonomy they'd lost in the decades since conquest. They fought alongside the Spanish, guided them through mountain passes, helped them understand the terrain and the climate, and the logistics of moving armies through the Andes. But the Spanish proved to be worse masters than the Inca had ever been, more demanding, more destructive, less interested in maintaining the systems that had allowed indigenous societies to function, and more focused on extracting wealth and souls, on converting and controlling, and fundamentally transforming everything they touched. Disease swept through the cloud forests with the Spanish, killing thousands who had no immunity to European pathogens, who had never been exposed to smallpox or measles or influenza, and therefore had no biological defenses against diseases that Europeans had lived with for centuries and developed some resistance to through generations of exposure. The die-off was catastrophic. Communities collapsing not because they were conquered in battle, but because disease killed so many people so quickly that social structures couldn't be maintained, that knowledge couldn't be transmitted. that the chain of cultural continuity was broken in a single generation. The survivors were forcibly relocated to lower elevations, where Spanish priests could more easily convert and control them, where they could be incorporated into the encomienda system that gave Spanish settlers rights to indigenous labor, where they could be watched and managed, and prevented from maintaining the autonomous communities that had characterized Chachapoyas culture for centuries. Within a generation, the cloud cities were abandoned, left to the mist and the moss, and the slow, patient work of the forest, reclaiming what had been taken from it. Cuelap stood empty, its walls still solid, but its houses collapsed, its plazas overgrown, its cisterns filled with leaves and debris. The sarcophagi in the cliffs continued to watch over valleys where no one lived, where the terraces slowly eroded and the irrigation channels filled with soil, and the evidence of human presence gradually faded until the Spanish themselves forgot exactly where these places were, until they became legends rather than locations, until later generations would argue about whether they'd ever existed at all, or were just stories told by conquistadors who exaggerated their achievements and invented civilizations to make their conquests seem more impressive. You stand and continue walking through Cuelap, and you realize that the fortress is not just a defensive structure, not just a military installation designed to repel enemies and protect inhabitants. It's a statement about how these people saw the world and their place in it, about what they valued and what they feared, and how they understood their relationship with the landscape that shaped their lives. They built high because they wanted to be close to the clouds, wanted to live in that liminal space between earth and heaven, between the solid ground of human existence and the infinite sky where gods or spirits or whatever forces they believed governed the cosmos might dwell. They wanted their dead to watch over the living from caves that looked out over everything below, that gave the dead a perspective on the world of the living, that elevated them above daily concerns, and let them see patterns and connections that the living, caught up in immediate needs and temporary problems, might miss. They didn't write their history because maybe they understood that written history is always about claiming, about declaring ownership, about saying this is ours, and this is how it happened, and this is why we deserve to be remembered. But the Chachapoyas seem to have had a different relationship with memory, with the past, with the question of how to be remembered by future generations. They built things that would speak for themselves, that would demonstrate their capabilities without needing to boast about them, that would remain mysterious enough to resist easy categorization or appropriation by peoples who came after, who might want to claim their achievements or minimize them, or explain them away in terms that served later political or cultural agendas. The mist is closing in now, thick enough that the ruins fade to gray shapes in the whiteness, thick enough that you can barely see 20 feet ahead, thick enough that you feel like you're wrapped in clouds, suspended between earth and sky, in the same way the Chachapoyas lived their lives, in that boundary space where categories blur and solid certainties dissolve into questions. And you think about all the knowledge that died with the Chachapoyas, all the engineering secrets that let them build on these impossible slopes, all the agricultural techniques that let them grow food in this challenging climate, all the astronomical observations they must have made during clear nights when the mist cleared and the stars appeared with the brilliant intensity they have at high altitudes far from artificial light. All the religious beliefs and social practices and daily rhythms that constituted their culture and made them who they were. There's a loss here, undeniably, a severing of connection between past and present that writing might have prevented, that texts explaining their practices and beliefs and history might have bridged. But there's also something else, something harder to name but impossible to ignore when you stand here in the ruins, wrapped in mist with walls rising around you, and the sense of presence that comes from being in a place where people lived intensely, where they devoted enormous effort to creating something that mattered to them. A kind of dignity in choosing not to explain yourself. A kind of strength in building things so well that they don't need explanation, that speak through their existence rather than through accompanying texts that tell you how to interpret them. A kind of wisdom and understanding that some knowledge is meant to be embodied, practiced, lived, not archived in texts that can be stolen or burned or misinterpreted by people who never walked these cloud-wrapped paths, never felt the vertigo of standing on a cliff edge 3,000 feet above the valley floor, never understood what it means to build a civilization in a place where the gods live, where every morning you wake up inside a cloud, and every night you fall asleep listening to mist drip from leaves in rhythms that sound almost like speech if you listen long enough. The fortress is empty now, except for tourists and archaeologists, except for people like you who come here trying to understand, trying to connect with something that's gone but not entirely lost, that speaks in silence, but speaks nonetheless. But standing here in the mist, you can almost feel the presence of those who built it, those who lived here, those who defended these walls against enemies who wanted to drag them down from the clouds into the lowlands where they could be controlled and counted and forced to explain themselves. The Chachapoyas resisted as long as they could, and when they finally fell, it wasn't because their fortresses failed, or their warriors weren't brave enough, or their culture wasn't sophisticated enough to survive contact with more powerful neighbors. It was because disease and displacement did what conquest couldn't do, broke the chain of memory that connected living people to this place and the knowledge required to maintain it, to live in balance with this challenging environment, to preserve the practices and beliefs that made Chachapoya's culture distinct and worth preserving. And maybe that's the lesson here, the uncomfortable truth that the Chachapoyas force you to confront when you stand in their ruins and think about what was lost when they disappeared. Writing doesn't guarantee survival. Libraries burn, manuscripts rot, languages die, and all the careful documentation in the world can't save a culture if the people who produced it are killed by disease or displaced from their homeland, or forcibly assimilated into conquering societies that erase their distinctiveness and replace it with imposed identities and practices. The Chachapoyas trusted stone and placement and the physical presence of their monuments to carry their message forward. And in some ways they were right. Quelap still stands. The sarcophagi still watch from their cliffs. The ruins still force you to acknowledge that something remarkable happened here, that people achieved something extraordinary in this impossible terrain. But in other ways they lost the gamble, because without words to anchor meaning, every generation gets to rewrite who they were, what they believed, why they mattered. The Spanish wrote them into history as warriors and allies, and eventually as victims of their own collaboration with conquest. Modern archaeologists write them into narratives about adaptation to extreme environments and the development of complex societies in marginal areas. Future scholars will write them differently still, projecting new concerns and new theoretical frameworks onto the silence they left behind. The path continues downward now, descending from the clouds into other landscapes, other mysteries, other civilizations that chose silence over explanation. But something stays with you from Quelap, from those watching faces in the cliffs, from the massive walls that rise into the mist like the bones of a dream that refused to be forgotten. These people understood that height is a kind of language, that building in impossible places is a kind of statement, that sometimes the most powerful message is the one that makes people climb 3,000 feet just to hear it, and even then refuses to be reduced to words, refuses to explain itself, refuses to make things easy for people who want simple answers to complicated questions about why cultures make the choices they make, and what those choices mean, and how we should remember peoples who chose not to tell us how they wanted to be remembered. Chapter 6. The Pattern of Silence. Voices from the Shadows. You've traveled through 5 civilizations now, 5 different cultures separated by oceans and millennia, by geography and climate, and all the circumstances that make one place different from another, all the factors that archaeologists use to explain why societies develop in distinct ways, why some build in stone and others in earth, why some live on mountains and others in river valleys, why the infinite variety of human culture produces such different solutions to the same basic problems of survival and meaning and community. And yet, something connects them all, something that whispers across the distances like wind through empty corridors, like the sound of breathing in a supposedly empty room, like the sense you get sometimes that you're being watched, even though you're alone. They all chose silence. Not the silence of ignorance or inability, not the silence that comes from not yet having developed the technology of writing, or the sophistication necessary to create systems for recording language in visual form, but the silence of intention, of design, of understanding something about permanence and memory, and the transmission of knowledge across generations that our modern world has forgotten, that we lost somewhere in our enthusiasm for documentation and our assumption that writing everything down represents progress rather than just a different set of trade-offs. And now, as you stand at the threshold of the final chapter, suspended in a moment between what you've learned and what you're about to understand, you need to see that these weren't isolated choices, weren't random accidents of history where cultures just happened not to develop writing before they disappeared, or were conquered, or transformed into something else. This was a pattern, consistent and deliberate, a way of thinking about knowledge and transmission that appeared independently across the globe, in cultures that never met, never traded, never even knew the other existed, never had any contact that might have let them share ideas or influence each other's development. They came to the same conclusion separately, repeatedly, in different times and different places. And that pattern is telling you something. If you're willing to listen, if you're willing to set aside your assumptions about progress and development, and the march of civilization from primitive to advanced. You're standing now in a place that exists between places, a conceptual space where all these silent civilizations overlap, where their choices echo and amplify each other, like sound waves reinforcing in a chamber designed for acoustics, where you can see connections that aren't visible when you look at each culture individually, but become obvious when you step back and see them together. See the pattern that emerges when you stop treating silence as absence and start recognizing it as presence, as a choice that says something important about how these peoples understood reality and their relationship to it. And from this vantage point, you begin to see others, more cultures that followed the same path, that made the same fundamental decision to trust stone and placement and mystery over the written word, that looked at writing and decided it wasn't for them, or wasn't sufficient for what they needed to preserve, or wasn't worth the costs that come with literacy and the changes it brings to how societies organize knowledge and power. They're emerging from the mist of history now, like stars appearing as the sun sets, like shapes becoming visible as your eyes adjust to darkness. Each one a point of light that says, we were here, we knew things, we built things, we created cultures that functioned and flourished, and produced art and architecture and ways of living that were sophisticated and complex. And we chose not to explain ourselves, chose not to write it down, chose not to leave the kind of documentation that would make archaeologists and historians comfortable, that would give you easy answers to your questions about who we were and what we believed, and why we did what we did. In what will one day be called Nigeria, in the Jos Plateau where the landscape shifts from savanna to something greener, more varied, more capable of supporting dense populations and specialized craft production, the Nok culture is shaping terracotta figures with such emotional depth, such psychological presence, such obvious skill in capturing not just the external appearance of human faces, but the internal states they express, that when archaeologists first discover them in the 20th century, unearthed by tin miners who were digging for ore and found instead these haunting faces staring up at them from layers of earth that had hidden them for 2,000 years, they'll struggle to believe they're as old as radiocarbon dating says they are. The sophistication seems wrong for the date. Seems like it should come later in the sequence of African art history. Seems like it represents a tradition that should have predecessors and descendants that we can trace through time, but instead it appears suddenly in the archaeological record around 1000 BCE, fully developed, showing no signs of the experimental phase where artists would have been learning techniques and developing styles, and then disappears just as suddenly around 500 CE, leaving almost no clear descendants. No cultures that obviously carry on the tradition. These aren't generic representations of the human form, aren't the kind of stylized figures that reduce people to simplified shapes and symbols. These are individuals, each face capturing a specific moment of feeling, a particular shade of emotion that's complex enough to resist easy categorization. Some smile with genuine warmth, with the kind of expression that comes from deep contentment or joy, with eyes that crinkle at the corners and mouths that curve upward in ways that make you want to smile back, even though you're looking at clay that was fired 2,000 years ago. Others gaze out with melancholic wisdom, with the expression of people who have seen too much, who carry knowledge that weighs on them, who understand things they wish they didn't have to understand, whose faces show the cost of consciousness, of being aware enough to recognize suffering and mortality, and all the aspects of existence that simpler creatures don't have to contemplate. Still others seem caught in the middle of speech, their mouths open as if they're about to tell you something important, as if they have words that need to be said, messages that need to be delivered, warnings or teachings or stories that matter enough to preserve in this frozen moment of articulation. But they never do. The words never come. The Nok left no writing, no texts that would tell you what these figures meant to say, no explanations of who these people were, or why their likenesses deserve to be preserved in clay that was carefully shaped and fired and buried in ways that suggest they were important, that they served purposes beyond simple decoration or idle craft, that they meant something to the communities that produced them, even if that meaning is now completely opaque to us. You move across the Atlantic now, your mind traveling the distances even as your body remains still. Back to North America, where different peoples were building different kinds of monuments to serve different purposes, but making the same choice about silence, about the relationship between knowledge and documentation. The Hopewell culture, flourishing in the Ohio River Valley between roughly 100 BCE and 500 CE, built earthworks so massive, so geometrically precise, so obviously designed according to principles that required mathematical understanding and coordinated labor, that they can only be fully appreciated from the air, from heights the builders could never reach unless they had balloons or aircraft, or some technology we have no evidence of. Unless they could somehow leave their bodies and fly above the landscape to see what they'd created, to verify that the proportions were correct, that the alignments worked, that the whole vast design held together when seen as a unified composition. These aren't random mounds thrown up wherever it was convenient, aren't simple burial sites that happen to be placed near each other. These are vast geometric complexes, perfect circles, connected to precise squares by long, straight walls of earth. Alignments that mark solar and lunar events with mathematical accuracy, that suggests not just casual observation, but generations of careful measurement and calculation, of tracking celestial movements and identifying patterns, and encoding that knowledge into landscape in ways that would survive without writing, without texts explaining the mathematics behind the positioning. The Newark earthworks in Ohio cover 4 square miles, a landscape transformed into a massive three-dimensional text that speaks in the language of geometry and astronomy, that requires you to walk through it to understand it, to stand in specific places at specific times and see how the earth shapes line up with celestial events, how the geometry creates relationships between earth and sky that are beautiful and functional and deeply meaningful, even if we can't fully reconstruct what they meant to the people who built them. But the Hopewell left no written explanation of what these shapes meant, no instruction manual for how to read them, no declaration of purpose that would tell us whether these were ceremonial centers or astronomical observatories, or territorial markers or something else entirely that doesn't fit into our categories. Just earth shaped with such precision that modern surveyors using GPS technology marvel at how accurate the angles are, how true the circles, how perfectly the sightlines align with celestial events that still occur on schedule millennia after the Hopewell disappeared, after their culture transformed into something else, or was absorbed by other peoples, or simply ended in ways we can only guess at, because they left no written record of their decline, their transformation, their reasons for abandoning these massive earthworks that represented such enormous investments of labor and time and collective effort. You turn eastward now, your awareness moving across continents, across the steppes of Kazakhstan, where the Tazmola culture built stone circles and burial mounds and left carved petroglyphs showing warriors on horseback and hunters pursuing game, and strange symbols that might be astronomical observations, or might be religious iconography, or might be something else entirely, that made sense in their symbolic vocabulary, but is meaningless to us without the cultural context that would explain what we're seeing. They worked gold with such skill that their jewelry rivals anything produced in the ancient world. Intricate pieces showing animals in mid-motion, caught at the peak of a leap, or the moment of attack. Frozen moments of life rendered with such attention to anatomical detail and dynamic tension that you can almost see the muscles moving beneath the skin, can almost feel the power and speed of the creatures they depicted with such obvious love and respect, and close observation of how animals actually move when they're fully alive, and engaged in the serious business of hunting, or fleeing, or fighting. But they didn't write their names on these pieces. didn't carve inscriptions declaring who made them, or who commissioned them, or who wore them into battle or burial. Didn't create texts that would explain what these animal images meant beyond the obvious associations with strength and speed, and the qualities that made these creatures successful in their environments. Just beauty, just skill, just objects that speak through their craftsmanship rather than through words, that demonstrate capabilities that required years to develop, and that were probably passed down through apprenticeship, through watching and imitating, and gradually developing the sensitivity and control necessary to work gold into these complex forms. Through the kind of knowledge transmission that happens in bodies and hands, rather than in texts and classrooms. And there are more. So many more that you could spend lifetimes studying them, and still not exhaust the catalog of cultures that chose silence, that built and created and flourished without leaving written explanations of themselves. In Sardinia, off the coast of Italy in the Mediterranean Sea, the Nuragic people built 7,000 stone towers across their island between roughly 1800 BCE and 500 BCE. Massive structures that still stand after 3,000 years. Each one different, each one adapted to its specific location and probably its specific purpose, creating a network of monuments whose distribution across the landscape suggests careful planning, suggests territorial organization, or defensive strategy, or religious significance, suggests purposes that made sense to the builders, but that remain completely mysterious because they never explained what these towers were for, why they were positioned where they are, what happened inside them or around them that justified the enormous effort required to build structures this large from stone, that had to be quarried and transported and lifted into place without metal tools, without mechanical advantage beyond simple levers and ramps, without anything but human muscle and determination. On the Canary Islands, volcanic islands off the coast of Africa that were isolated from the mainland for thousands of years until European contact in the 14th century, the Guanche people mummified their dead with such skill that the bodies remained preserved centuries later, wrapped in leather and goat skins, and placed in caves where the dry climate helped preservation, but where the primary preservation came from the techniques they used, from their understanding of how to prepare bodies so that flesh doesn't rot, so that features remain recognizable, so that the dead can continue to be present to the living, in physical form, rather than just in memory. But the language they spoke is dead, killed by Spanish colonization that imposed Castilian and suppressed indigenous languages until no native speakers remained, until the last person who could speak Guanche died, taking the language with them. And any writing system they might have had is lost, if it ever existed. And the reasons for their mummification practices died with the culture that practiced them, leaving us with preserved bodies, but no explanation of why preservation mattered to them. What beliefs about death and afterlife and the relationship between living and dead motivated such careful treatment of corpses? In southern Africa, in what is now Zimbabwe, the people who built Great Zimbabwe created massive stone walls without mortar, using a dry stone technique that relies on careful fitting and gravity rather than binding materials, creating enclosures and passages and towers that still puzzle archaeologists because there's no written record of who built them or when exactly they were built, beyond rough dating from associated artifacts, or why they were built in this configuration, or what social organization or political structure could coordinate the labor and maintain the site for the centuries it was occupied. The European colonizers who first saw these ruins in the 19th century couldn't believe that Africans had built them, couldn't reconcile the sophistication of the architecture with their racist assumptions about African capabilities, and so they invented elaborate theories about Phoenician traders or lost tribes of Israel or ancient Arabian kingdoms. Anything to avoid acknowledging that indigenous Africans could create architecture this sophisticated without leaving written explanations that would make them intelligible to European scholars, who assumed that real civilization always involved writing, always involved the kind of documentation that they were familiar with from their own traditions. You're beginning to see the pattern now. Beginning to understand that this wasn't failure or primitiveness or lack of development, wasn't cultures that would have written if only they'd been smart enough to invent the technology or sophisticated enough to see its utility. This was choice, repeated across cultures and continents and historical periods, a consistent decision to trust certain forms of knowledge transmission over others, to value certain ways of preserving memory and meaning that didn't depend on writing, that worked differently than literacy works, that produced different results and different costs and different benefits than written cultures experience. And the pattern reveals something profound about human possibilities, about the multiple ways that societies can be complex and sophisticated and successful, about the fact that our categories of development and progress might be more limited than we think, might describe only one path among many that humans have taken in their efforts to create meaningful lives and enduring cultures. The pattern reveals that these cultures understood something crucial, that writing changes knowledge, that putting words to paper, or carving them into stone, transforms the nature of what's being preserved in ways that aren't always positive, in ways that involve losses as well as gains. Writing makes knowledge portable, yes, makes it possible to transmit information across vast distances and long periods of time without requiring face-to-face contact between teacher and student, without requiring the slow process of apprenticeship, where knowledge is demonstrated and practiced, and gradually absorbed through participation rather than instruction. But it also makes knowledge vulnerable to misinterpretation, to deliberate corruption by people who want to change what was said to serve their own purposes, to translation errors that can completely reverse original meanings, or introduce subtle distortions that accumulate over time until the text says something very different from what it originally meant. Writing allows knowledge to travel across time and space, but it also removes knowledge from its context, separates it from the lived experience that gave it meaning in the first place, turns wisdom into information that can be memorized without being understood, that can be repeated without being embodied, that can be known in some abstract intellectual sense without being integrated into practice and behavior in the way you actually live your life. You can read about meditation without ever sitting still and watching your breath. You can read about courage without ever facing danger. You can read about love without ever opening your heart to another person. Writing creates a gap between knowing and doing that oral cultures don't have, or have less of, that changes the relationship between knowledge and knower in ways that these silent cultures might have recognized and rejected. You think about the Muisca people of Colombia, living in the highlands of the eastern Cordillera, where the climate is cool and the land is fertile, and communities could grow large and complex, who created the legend of El Dorado not through written accounts, but through ritual, through the actual practice of a new chief covering himself in gold dust and diving into Lake Guatavita as an offering to the gods, as a way of demonstrating that wealth exists to be given away rather than hoarded, that power comes with obligations to the sacred forces that govern the world, that leadership means sacrifice rather than accumulation. The ceremony was real, witnessed by people who participated in it, or watched it happen, transmitted through oral tradition from generation to generation as a story about what leadership meant in Muisca culture, about the relationship between humans and the divine, about the proper use of wealth and the dangers of greed. But the Spanish heard stories of this ceremony from indigenous informants and transformed it in their minds from a religious ritual into a city of gold, a place called El Dorado that could be conquered and looted, that represented unimaginable wealth just waiting to be taken by whoever was brave enough or ruthless enough to find it. They searched for El Dorado for centuries, mounting expedition after expedition into jungles and mountains and swamps, destroying indigenous cultures in their quest, enslaving guides who they tortured to make them reveal the location of a city that never existed, that was always a misunderstanding, always a corruption of a story about spiritual values into a fantasy about material wealth. They never understood that they were looking for a ceremony, not a place, that the gold was never meant to be possessed, but to be given away, that the whole point was the act of offering, the demonstration that even the most valuable materials are less important than maintaining proper relationships with the sacred. Would the Muisca have been better off if they'd written down their beliefs? If they'd explained their ceremonies in texts that the Spanish could read and understand? Or would that written explanation have simply given the conquistadors a more efficient roadmap for destroying what they didn't comprehend? Would it have provided blueprints for dismantling the culture more completely? Would it have made the Muisca more vulnerable rather than less, because everything they valued would have been exposed in writing that could be studied and analyzed and countered by people who wanted to erase indigenous religions and replace them with Christianity? And then there's Rapa Nui, Easter Island, that tiny speck of land in the vast Pacific Ocean, one of the most isolated inhabited places on Earth, where the inhabitants developed a writing system called Rongo Rongo sometime before European contact, one of the very few independent inventions of writing in human history, one of the rare cases where people who had no contact with literate societies somehow developed the technology of encoding language in visual symbols on their own, demonstrating that writing isn't something that can only be invented once and then spread through cultural contact, but is a possibility that different peoples can discover independently when circumstances make it useful or necessary or appealing. For whatever reasons motivate people to create new technologies, they carved these symbols onto wooden tablets, creating texts that recorded something important enough to merit the invention of an entirely new script, something that needed to be preserved in more permanent form than oral tradition could provide, something that justified the enormous effort of developing a writing system from scratch, without any models to follow or traditions to build on. But when European diseases and Peruvian slave raids decimated the population in the 19th century, killing 9/10 of the islanders in just a few decades, the knowledge of how to read Rongo Rongo died with the last elders who possessed it, with the last people who had been trained in the traditional ways, and who understood what the symbols meant and how they functioned as a writing system. The tablets remain, housed in museums around the world, covered in symbols that we can see but cannot read, texts that speak in a language we've lost, knowledge that was preserved in writing but became inaccessible anyway. Because writing alone isn't enough, because you also need the living tradition of people who know how to read it and can teach others and can maintain the chain of transmission that connects past and present. And maybe that's the ultimate demonstration of what these silent civilizations understood. why they might have looked at writing and decided it wasn't sufficient for their purposes, wasn't the guarantee of preservation that we assume it is. Because writing doesn't guarantee that anything will be understood by future generations, doesn't ensure that texts will remain readable or meaningful or connected to the contexts that gave them significance. The Rongo tablets survived but became mute, turned into objects that we can study as artifacts but can't read as texts, that preserve marks on wood but not the meanings those marks were meant to convey. They're as silent now as if they'd never been written, as opaque as stones that bear no writing at all, demonstrating that the medium of preservation matters less than the survival of the culture that created it. That texts without readers are just decorated surfaces. That writing requires not just encoding, but also decoding. Not just preservation, but also interpretation. Not just survival, but also understanding. You're standing now at the edge of everything you've seen. All these cultures and their choices spreading out before you like a map written in absence and mystery. Like a text composed of gaps and silences and the spaces between what's said and what's left unsaid. And you realize that they're asking you a question, all of them together, their voices combining into a single inquiry that echoes across the centuries, across the distances, across all the barriers of time and language and culture that separate you from them. They're asking, what are you building that will outlast your explanations? What are you creating that speaks through its existence rather than through the words you wrap around it? What knowledge are you protecting by keeping it mysterious, by refusing to reduce it to text that can be misunderstood or corrupted or stolen by those who have no context to comprehend it, no preparation to receive it responsibly, no commitment to honoring what it represents, rather than just exploiting it for purposes the original keepers never intended? These civilizations didn't fail to develop writing. They looked at writing, some of them, understood its capabilities and its limitations, recognized what it could do and what it couldn't do, saw the benefits and the costs. And many of them chose differently. They chose to build their knowledge into landscape and stone and astronomical alignment and artistic skill, into things that couldn't be burned by invading armies or translated incorrectly by scholars who didn't understand the original context, into monuments that would force future generations to engage with them physically, to stand in the right place at the right time, to experience rather than simply read, to feel in their bodies what can't be captured in words, to understand through encounter rather than through explanation. They chose mystery over explanation because they understood that some truths are too important to risk reducing them to words, too profound to capture in language, too sacred to make accessible to people who haven't done the preparation necessary to receive them properly. They understood that the most valuable knowledge isn't the kind that can be easily transmitted, isn't the kind that you can just download and install like software, but the kind that requires transformation in the learner, that demands that you become different before you can understand it, that changes you in the process of learning it, so that what you know and who you are become inseparable. The sun is setting on this journey now, and the shadows are growing long across all these ancient places, across the stones of Tiwanaku and the mounds of Cahokia, and the faces of the Olmec, and the pottery of Vinča, and the fortresses of the Chachapoyas, and all the other silent monuments that pattern the earth like punctuation marks in a sentence whose meaning we're still learning to read. You've seen stones that fit together impossibly well, cities built from earth and aligned with the moon, faces carved with such presence that they seem about to speak, symbols that might be writing, or might be something else entirely, fortresses in the clouds that defy understanding, and patterns of silence that repeat across the world like themes in a symphony, like variations on a question that keeps being asked in different ways, but always comes back to the same fundamental inquiry about what it means to know and to remember and to preserve what matters across the vast expanses of time. And through it all, one lesson emerges clearly, like a signal coming through static, like a message that's been waiting for you to be ready to hear it, that civilization doesn't require writing, that sophistication and silence can coexist, that some of the most advanced cultures in human history chose not to explain themselves because they understood that explanation diminishes, that words betray, that the most profound messages are the ones that refuse to be reduced to language, that resist translation, that insist on being encountered directly, in all their mystery and complexity and irreducible presence. These silent architects trusted future generations to be curious enough, humble enough, attentive enough to learn their languages of stone and shadow and celestial alignment. They trusted that what they built would speak for itself if we're willing to listen in the right way, if we're willing to set aside our assumptions and our categories and our insistence that everything must be explained to be understood, if we're willing to accept that some forms of knowledge can only be gained through experience, through standing in specific places and feeling what they were designed to make you feel, through engaging with mystery rather than trying to solve it. And, standing here at the end of this journey, you understand that they were right. Their monuments still speak. Their mysteries still compel. Their silence still has more to say than most written empires ever did. Still asks better questions than most texts ever answered. Still challenges us to think differently about what it means to know something, to understand something, to preserve something across the generations in ways that honor its complexity, rather than reducing it to information that can be memorized and repeated without being lived. The question now is, are we listening? Are we willing to engage with knowledge that refuses to explain itself? Are we humble enough to admit that maybe, just maybe, these ancient peoples understood something about wisdom and memory and permanence that our writing-obsessed civilization has forgotten, that we lost in our rush to document everything, that we sacrificed in our assumption that progress means more information rather than deeper understanding? The path ends here, but the questions continue. The silence remains, and the stones still wait, patient as always, for those willing to stand before them and understand that some messages are too important to be written down, that some truths can only be known through the kind of encounter that changes you, that some wisdom is preserved not by being explained, but by being experienced, by being felt in your bones and your blood, and the deep places in your consciousness where words have never reached and never will. The gift of silence. You've walked through 6 chapters now, through monuments and mysteries, through cultures that spoke without words and left messages carved not in language, but in stone and placement, and the careful observation of celestial movements that required generations of patient watching, of standing in the same places at the same times, year after year, until patterns emerged, until the universe revealed its rhythms to those attentive enough to notice, dedicated enough to remember, wise enough to encode what they learned into forms that would survive without explanation. And now, standing at the end of this journey, you find yourself in a different kind of silence. Not the silence of absence, not the quiet that comes when something is missing or has been lost, but the silence of understanding. The profound quiet that settles over you when you've heard something so deep, so fundamental, so true, that words feel inadequate to contain it, that speaking would somehow diminish what you've come to know. Not through explanation, but through experience, through the slow accumulation of encounters with mystery that gradually taught you to see differently, to listen differently, to understand that not everything that matters can be said. The question that opened this journey was simple, almost innocent in its phrasing. What if the most advanced civilizations never wrote a single word? But now you understand that the question itself was backwards, was asking from the wrong direction, was still caught in the assumption that writing represents progress and silence represents lack. These cultures weren't advanced despite their silence. They were advanced because of it. They understood something about the nature of knowledge and memory that we've spent the last few thousand years forgetting, something that gets lost every time we assume that writing equals progress, that documentation equals sophistication, that the ability to explain yourself in texts that can be stored and retrieved and studied is the ultimate measure of what it means to be civilized, to be developed, to be worthy of remembering and being remembered. The stones at Tiwanaku still fit together with impossible precision, still challenge every engineer who studies them to explain how such accuracy was achieved without the tools and techniques we assume are necessary for work this precise. The mounds at Cahokia still mark the movements of celestial bodies, still function as calendars for anyone willing to stand in the right places and watch how shadows move across their surfaces at different times of the year. The Olmec heads still gaze across centuries with expressions that defy simple interpretation, that seem to change depending on the light and your mood and what you bring to the encounter, that remain stubbornly individual and human despite the passage of 3,000 years. The Vinča symbols still hint at meanings we can't quite grasp, still suggest that there are ways of preserving knowledge that we haven't fully understood, that our categories of writing and non-writing might be too simple to capture what they were actually doing. The fortresses at Colossal still cling to cliffsides in the clouds, still demonstrate that some peoples chose to build in impossible places, not because they had to, but because the very impossibility of the location was part of the message, part of what they wanted to communicate about their relationship with the landscape and the divine. And all of them, together, create a chorus of silence that speaks louder than any written text, that communicates something profound about what it means to know, to remember, to build something that will outlast not just your life, but your entire civilization, that will continue to speak long after your language has died and your beliefs have been forgotten, and everything that made you, specifically you, has dissolved into the anonymity of deep time. You're standing now in the last light of this journey, and the question comes to you quietly, without fanfare, settling into your awareness like dust settling on still water. What are you building in your own life that will speak without words? What are you creating that communicates through presence rather than explanation? That doesn't require instruction manuals or accompanying texts to be understood? What knowledge are you cultivating that lives in your hands and eyes and heart, that can only be transmitted through the slow, patient work of showing someone else how to see what you see, how to feel what you feel, how to know what you know, in ways that go deeper than information, deeper than facts, into the realm of wisdom that transforms rather than just informs. These silent civilizations aren't asking you to stop writing. They're not saying that literacy is bad or that documentation has no value, or that we should return to some imaginary pre-literate past where everything was better because nothing was written down. They're asking you to remember that writing isn't the only way to know, isn't the only way to remember, isn't the only way to leave a message that matters. They're asking you to consider that maybe, sometimes, the most profound truths are the ones that can't be explained, only experienced, only felt, only understood by standing in the presence of something so well made, so carefully positioned, so intentionally mysterious, that it forces you to stop and wonder and question everything you thought you knew about what's possible, about how humans can preserve meaning across vast gulfs of time, about whether words are adequate for the most important things we need to say to each other, and to ourselves, and to whatever comes after us. The journey ends here, in silence. Not the silence of ending, but the silence of beginning. Because now you've heard what these ancient voices have to say. Now you understand that their lack of words was itself a message, was itself a choice, that communicated something about what they valued and how they understood the relationship between knowledge and language. You can't unhear it. You can't return to the simple assumption that civilization equals writing, that sophistication requires explanation, that the measure of human achievement is carved in the words we leave behind. You've been changed by this journey, even if you can't quite explain how, even if the change is too subtle or too deep to capture in language, even if what you've learned exists somewhere below the level of words, in the place where understanding happens before it gets translated into speech. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe that's exactly what these silent architects intended all along. They didn't want to tell you what to think. They wanted to make you think. They didn't want to give you answers. They wanted to give you better questions. They didn't want to be understood easily, quickly, completely. They wanted to remain mysterious enough that each generation would have to engage with them fresh, would have to do the work of understanding for themselves, would have to earn whatever insights they gained, rather than simply inheriting them passively from texts that do your thinking for you. The stones are still waiting. The mounds are still speaking. The faces are still watching. And the question they're all asking, the question that echoes across millennia of deliberate silence, is this: are you ready to listen to what can't be written? Are you willing to learn what can only be experienced? Are you brave enough to build something that will matter, not because future generations can read about it, but because they'll have no choice but to feel it, to stand in its presence and understand in their bones that something profound happened here, something that words could never fully capture, something that demanded silence, because silence was the only language adequate to express what needed to be said. The silence has spoken. The rest is up to you. And as you prepare to leave this journey behind, to return to the world of words and explanations, and the constant documentation of everything, one final thought settles over you like evening settling over a landscape. Maybe the greatest gift these silent civilizations left us isn't the stones, or the mounds, or the monuments themselves. Maybe it's the questions they force us to ask about our own choices, our own assumptions, our own relationship with knowledge and memory and the future. Maybe they're teaching us, still, across all this time and distance, that there are many ways to be wise, many ways to be remembered, many ways to speak truth that don't require words at all. And in teaching us that, in forcing us to see that silence can be as eloquent as speech, as meaningful as text, as powerful as any library or archive or collection of written wisdom, they give us permission to wonder. What truths are we drowning out with our constant need to explain? What mysteries are we solving too quickly, too easily, without giving them time to teach us what they know? What silence are we filling that should be left empty, that needs space to breathe and resonate and speak in its own wordless way? Sleep now. Let these questions settle into your dreams, and when you wake, perhaps you'll see the world differently. Perhaps you'll notice the messages that exist in placement and presence, rather than in words. Perhaps you'll understand that the most important things have never needed explanation, have always spoken directly to those willing to listen, in the language that predates speech, that will survive long after the last words have been spoken and forgotten. The language of stone and shadow and silence that says, "We were here, we mattered, we knew, and we trusted you to be wise enough to understand without being told." The ancient architects are still waiting in the silence, and they'll wait as long as it takes for us to learn what they already knew.